Okay, so this is going to be the beginning of these pre-recorded videos that I will be posting regularly throughout the semester to complement the things that we are discussing in our class. We are discussing many things, right? The nature of this course on worldviews. So as such, we have to be constantly looking to make connections, not just connections between the novel Dune and the specific elements of worldviews that we will be exploring taking place during the 1960s, which is the focus, but also looking for connections between those actual events that occurred in the 60s and through the 70s up to the present time. All right, and we're always going to want to, as I explained in class, to bring it back and see how it is being mirrored to a certain extent in the novel. So we've touched on a few things already, and we will be continuing our discussion at our next class on the concept of the hero, in particular the hero within a political context, and how the hero in that political context has a worldview and is attempting to administer that worldview within the realm of developing policies specific to that country that the politician is a part of, and having to explore how that worldview can be realized and with the competing worldviews and the conflict that entails, and therefore the modifications and compromises that have to be made in relation to that worldview in order to develop something that is practical, pragmatic, and manageable. Understanding that there are forces very much in opposition to that worldview, but also in opposition in this fight for power. Okay, and that's the nature of so much of what we're going to be discussing, is the vying for power, right? Because in order to implement any kind of worldview, no matter how powerful you may be within a particular society, without the power to do so, it remains simply an idea or an ideal, right? And as such, it's limited in terms of actually being able to realize anything, in which case, where's its value? Right? The worldview, in the context in which we are exploring it, without its implementation, lacks value, and without value, it's, dare I go there, it's just fantasy. All right, so again, you see how there's a connection between the novel we're reading, which is a fantasy, it's science fiction, but is of the fantastic to a large extent, versus the actual realization and the actual events that transpire as this power struggle is in play. And these power struggles are part of human nature. And it involves a variety of sociological interactions, psychological interactions, and of course political interactions. as we were discussing in class, as we're looking at John F. Kennedy at this point, right, who comes into office as president of the United States in 1960 or 61, and is immediately placed in a position of conflict because it's the Cold War. And what we'll be looking at in this week and probably spilling into next week are some of the details of that particular Cold War conflicts, the Bay of Pigs, and the Cuban Missile Crisis to begin with. And of course, that will move towards a discussion of U.S. involvement in the Civil War in Vietnam, North and South Vietnam, and beyond. So we're looking at actual political events as they unfold, usually related and surrounding conflict, but we're looking at how the vision, the worldview of the parties involved are explained, disseminated, right, to the masses, to the people, to get those people on board, to have support for that position and that course of action, and what is really necessary in terms of political intrigue, if you will, to work towards that, to make progress towards that goal, with a recognition, and this is one of the things we're going to explore, if there is this recognition, that the perfecting of that worldview is often not realistic. So to make progress towards it in order to shape society, community, country, world, into the image of what that worldview suggests. All right? We started looking at last class at John F. Kennedy's inauguration speech. We're going to come back to that on Friday. I want to go through that in detail because it's really him laying out a worldview, right? But we have to understand the context in which he is laying it out there, right? This is a speech, and who is the audience, right? The audience is the American people. It's the inauguration of the president, but it's also an audience very much of the world, given that the United States at this point in history is one of the two world powers, in particular in the relation to this Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States. And so we have to look at that speech carefully and see how it is meant to appeal to an ideology very much rooted in the history of the United States, right? Rooted in the Constitution of the United States and what that Constitution has become in terms of what it means and represents for the American people and the rest of the world. And a lot of that is a result of interpretation. The Constitution of the United States was written in 1775, 76, right? And that gives many, many years of people reading it and interpreting it and modifications to it. And all that is shaping the ideology that is encased in U.S. liberal democracy, right? And how does the leader of that democracy continue with that foundational worldview in a world that is very much changing? There was no Soviet Union back in 1776. The context there was the American Revolution, to free themselves from the colonial rule of the British Empire. right? And it also speaks to the psychology of a people, of a society, of a community, of a country that is indoctrinated to some extent into that foundational ideology. And this is the masses, if you will, who are not engaged in a constant interpretive process of analyzing what all that means, right? Because they have lives to live, but they are indoctrinated into the basic principles of such an ideology through their upbringing, through the school systems, and through the society, how the society is designed. Right? Since we're talking about the United States, it's very much in relatively obvious and simple ways. Growing up in the United States, going back many years, certainly when I was a child, every day was started with a Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I mean, that's so deeply ingrained into my psyche, whatever, because every day we said that. And a whole generation, a few generations, are indoctrinated, as that's part of the indoctrination. And then how is history taught, right? Because it always comes down to the youth and the education that you're giving the children, which shapes the way that they develop their worldviews. And we see that in other societies that very much have an educational system that is designed in many ways to enhance that particular world vision within the minds of the upcoming generation. What's actually going on in the political realm is often not just deviating from those basic principles involved with that worldview and that ideology, but is often in direct opposition to it. And that's the stuff that tends to not be transparent. The things that a government has to do in their justification for it, in order to achieve certain goals. So there's a lot of maneuvering, right? There's certainly a lot of deception in the bigger conflicts, say, between the United States and the Soviet Union, right? You have to deceive so they don't know what your plans may be. And we're going to see a lot of this in Dune, right? That's politics and war and things like that. But that deception goes beyond just the conflict between the two adversarial governments, say. It happens within the communities themselves, which is seemingly antithetical to the very principles of that worldview. And one of the questions we're asking, but is it necessary? If we have total transparency and everyone can recognize and anticipate actions that we will take, etc., then that government, that power becomes vulnerable. And remember that it is in this global conflict in many respects. It is a power battle for power, for dominance, to shut down interference. And we see that on a microcosmic level, even within the political systems of any democracy, right? Where we have one party pitted against another. right, in a conflict of its own. And sometimes it's hard to see that if we take Canada or the United States, which is as a country pursuing and attempting to further the worldview that that country, based on a constitution or whatever it may be, is not as united as one would expect for a power entity such as a country. So in Canada, we have the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, and there are, and of course the NDP and other parties, that's the parliamentary system that Canada has as opposed to the United States, where there are conflicts within the entity itself. And the nature of those conflicts, the nature of how to navigate through those conflicts often involves behavior and actions that are undercutting the overarching premise, the overarching view, overarching worldview that that country may have. So it's a plethora of conflicts, competing ideologies, of varying differences, radical differences if we look from country to country, United States versus Soviet Union, but differences and conflicts nonetheless within the United States, within Canada, in the 1960s and right up through today, which we see on a regular basis if we are paying attention to what is going on in the political realm of any country. And democracies in particular, where there is more openness than, say, dictatorial regimes. And certainly with the Soviet Union, before the Soviet Union was disbanded, I mean, it was a very closed political system. Opposition to the political powers in that be were silenced. And we see that in a lot of countries and communities today. It's a standard practice, if you can consolidate your power, that you want to maintain that power. You want to maintain that power because you want to achieve something that is directly related to your worldview. And if there's opposition to attaining that from within or without, you want to silence it. You want to navigate through it, right? And that takes the form in terms of actions that are taken to navigate through that. Those actions vary. On its most extreme level, it leads to war, right? And even wars within a country itself, civil wars, and rebellions that then hamper the entire process of trying to achieve that world vision. And of course, there's always factors of the unknown that can come in and be obstacles to achieving that. The idea, certainly ingrained in the attempt to achieve that end goal of whatever that worldview is, often, and this goes back throughout history, as we discussed in class. I know this is a bit repetitive, but it's again just to remind us where we're at, revolves around the concept of a hero, a leader who is believed to be working towards that world vision, but also a leader who can galvanize a populace, the cult of personality, the charismatic nature of that leader, to get people to follow, even if there is deviation from the fundamental principles of that worldview. that leader, that hero, needs to have such a presence that the hero can convince, sway the people to follow, even when it's to follow in areas that seem to be antithetical to the principles of that vision. We're going to look at that in detail, starting with Kennedy. Right? We're going to see how that contrasts with similar behavioral patterns among leaders / heroes in the Soviet Union. We're going to look at that in terms of the conflict in Vietnam. Right? When we see, even in today's society, in many communities, including our own, especially during political elections, how is that hero created? How realistic is the image that is created? The images on the big billboards of these political leaders. How are they designed by the political machines to be appealing? And who do they appeal to? And why do they have an appeal if there's no depth to the image creation? This is the essence, in many respects, to hero worship, right? And it's important to understand that distinction. You know, what constitutes a hero? You're doing your assignments now, and I'm going to get an idea of what you perceive to be the hero. But what happens when there is a worship, right? And that's very much a theological, religious term, which we will be discussing at length. Because when following a leader becomes worshiping a leader, worshiping a hero, it suggests an attitude of giving oneself to the hero. I trust the hero. Right? There's problems in our society. Superman has arrived. And okay, Superman, we will bow to you because we know you're going to take care of it. Because we don't know how to take care of it. We don't know how to fight that enemy and so on, but we will trust you. And then when you are successful, if you are successful, often that trust will turn into a kind of worship. And what Frank Herbert in Dune is suggesting is there's an inherent danger involved with that idea of the hero. And yet that idea of the hero is also inherent in human behavior, human nature, it's argued, right? There's always been the leader who people turn to, who takes on the role of the hero. And there's obviously different, levels of that, right? It's not just that the Prime Minister of Canada is the only political leader / hero, right? It breaks down into all different stages and all different hierarchies, right down to our own individual family units, where we may have that one member of the family that we all turn to as being the one who will take care of everything. We certainly, as children, we have that view of our parents, whether we're conscious of it or not, as being a type of hero. Whether that kind of hero attitude that the child has towards their parents is maintained, well, a lot of that depends on what the family unit is like, and as they get older and become more aware and are able to challenge things. And same thing within a political system in the country, where at first there may be a kind of hero admiration leading to a hero worship, but if things don't go well, that can turn abruptly. In our system, the Canadian system, in any democracy, whether it's parliamentary or such as we have in Canada or in the United States in its system, we have cycles of election. In the United States, it's very rigid. Every 4 years, the leader will be challenged, right? And keep in mind, in the United States as well, no president can run for a third term. The maximum amount of time that that individual can remain as president of the United States is 8 years. By law, written into the Constitution, right, no one can run for a third term, right? And that was put in place as a means of avoiding too much of the potential for a tyrant to emerge, right, who manages to have that cult of personality to such an extent that he or she gets reelected and reelected, right? And again, it's not just with a complicated electoral system in the United States, and that challenges, that possibility challenges the foundational core of American constitutional democracy that is designed specifically to curtail any possibility of any kind of tyrannical rule, right? Because the idea being is you can never reach a full level of tyranny in just 8 years. And of course, as we discussed in class, all the other checks and balances that are in the system, in the legislative branch of government, right? So the House of Commons, the Congress, and the Senate, and the judicial, which is the Supreme Court, and the executive branch. All right. So again, it's all designed because it was initially put in play in opposition to a monarchy, the British Empire and their monarchy. And a monarchy is absolute rule, was, not anymore, right? Most monarchs are just figureheads today. But of course, the history of monarchies is the king has absolute authority. And one is a king for life. And that title, that position of being a king, is then passed down through the same family. And if we go back, to medieval times and so on, very much when there was no attempt to separate church and state, the king was perceived as a direct representative of God, usually with the blessing in a Catholic society of the Pope. And that allowed for absolute rule. And democracy is very much opposed to that. It's supposed to be for the people. But even within any kind of system, there is the need for some kind of leadership, and that leadership is, by necessity, must engage with the people to have the followers and to move that country, especially if it's a powerful country, towards a continuation and further progress towards that world view. So we're going to see how that all is in play in the 60s during the Cold War, in particular through the United States, and how that is being again reflected in the novel Dune. So that's just a recap of what we've been covering. I do want to look a bit at the novel Dune. We looked at the first chapter in a fair amount of detail in class, right? And in that we met the House Atreides, right? That's Paul's house and Leto's house, right? That's one of the power players. I want to take a quick look. Again, I'm going to try and keep these videos to an hour, no more than that. So I've already gone about a half hour here. So I want to look at the text of Dune, where, because you guys are reading ahead, and it's important to be attentive to that reading and to recognize things when we talk about in class, when we talk about specific political events and so on that are transpiring in the 1960s, and see how that reflects in the novel and in this idea of the hero. For now, the leadership in the hero and the power brokers. We're going to look at many other things related to the culture of the 60s, the age of Aquarius, the age of rebellion, the age of challenging authority, the drug culture, the expressive nature of that rebellion through music and other means. And as you've probably gathered by now, as you're reading ahead in Dune, these are reflected in the novel as well. And we're seeing how all that ultimately comes into shape, modify worldviews from the level of the individual up to the political leadership and the political power. And often the individual or the smaller communities within that bigger society, their worldview in rebellion can then be very contrary to in many respects, though holding the same similar foundation with the governing powers in terms of a worldview. Certainly we'll be exploring that concept in the anti-Vietnam movement and the demonstrations against American involvement in Vietnam, and how that was transformative in modifying the overarching worldview of the United States. And this is the other thing to keep in mind, that often these worldviews, they're in constant flux. They're being modified as the context in which the implementation of such a view changes. Again, as I said at the beginning, the Constitution of the United States was written in a very different time, right? You hear a lot of talk, as an example, you hear a lot of talk in the United States about the Second Amendment, which is the right to bear arms, to carry guns. How familiar you are, we can touch on this as well, and I'm sure we will to some degree. But I bring it up now in the context of when that Second Amendment was introduced, it was a very different world in the United States than it was in 1960 or as it is today. And yet this battle over the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, to carry guns, to have access to guns, is one of the most contentious issues in American politics. Right? It's one of the examples where there hasn't been a modification to it to any great degree to account for the changing context of our existence today. And that is a battle with tradition, right? If it's something that is part of the tradition, then and this also spills over into religious and theological perspectives as well. Another theme that, as we've discussed, is very much in Dune and very much in our society today and in the 60s and so on. Right? We've touched on this and we'll continually come back to it, this idea of separation of church and state and the power of the theological thinking and political theology, which of course has a direct tie-in with what I was talking about earlier in terms of hero worship. And the worship being a term associated with religious belief. All right, it's a lot, I know, but it's a bit repetitive regarding what we talked about in class, but it can be heady stuff. So that, we need to absorb it, in order to then be able to make connections and have a better understanding of what all the implications suggest. So we have a better understanding of our world, better understanding of our government's world vision, worldview, and ultimately so that we can have a better understanding of our own worldview. and to develop it and fine tune it and make it perhaps something a little more understandable and practical, perhaps, and achievable, feasible, so that we can get closer to it, whatever it may be. All right. So I was going to go and talk a little more about Kennedy's inauguration speech, but we'll do that in class. And I do want to touch, and I'm going to try and do this on a regular basis, is come back to the novel. All right, because my sense is we're I don't know if we're going to have enough. I'll make the time to talk about it in class, the novel, but there's so much other things to cover in class. So I want to make sure that you are keeping up with the reading and you're not getting lost in much of the layers in this novel of political intrigue and religious intrigue and, you know, the Ben Gesserit and all this stuff. We talked about it, and I am putting together or will direct you towards sites that have this laid out in a kind of encyclopedic form. So you'll be able to look things up regarding a lot of the terms, which are, you know, it's science fiction. It's not things we can draw on, but it's important to be familiar with them to see if they relate to actual societies and so on that were in play in the 60s and even today. So just again, as a reminder, all these little openings attributed often to Princess Irulan, all right, and so on. You don't gloss over them. They can be confusing because, you know, we're sitting there, you know, who is Princess Irulan and so on, and that's something that we've been looking for since this is, you know, from the manual of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan. So we have to presume that she's a character somewhere in here. All right, and we'll see what happens. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on the first chapter because we already did. This is where we are meeting our main characters. We have already established that Paul is going to be the hero, political leader, religious leader, right? At this stage, he's only 15 years old, and his father is the leader of this, this clan, if you will, the Atreides. Just as a reminder, again, we're introduced to a lot of characters here, the Fremen and so on. You should be coming along in the novel, so I'm curious. One of the things I'll ask you on Friday is to give me feedback as to where you're at and how you're starting to see all these things materialize. Scroll on down here a bit. I highlighted this, and I think I really drew your attention to this litany. I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. And when it has gone past, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. It's a cryptic, yes, but you want to keep this in mind, right? Obviously, the emphasis on fear, and this, of course, relates very specifically to the qualities of a leader who will allay the fears of the masses. And of course, that leader then can't demonstrate any fear themselves. So you can see how this applies to a quality that a leader must have. But of course, it's also, and this is very much in Frank Herbert's worldview himself, it should apply to the individual, right? And remember, much of this, and you would have seen that from the document I posted that was written by Frank Herbert about be wary, the dangers, the potential dangers of hero worship. That it saps individuality. It saps the ability of the individual to realize his or her full potential, because it's all transferred, all the concerns and the actions are then placed on that leader. So I don't have to worry about it because he or she's going to take care of it. So I don't have to learn more about it. I don't have to do my research. I can have a little, a much more relaxed life. And of course, keep that in mind in terms of the Voltairean jihad, right? The crusade that they talk about here that happened in the past, which was a crusade to wipe out the machines, because the machines had taken on the role of these types of leaders, and people then were no longer pursuing the mindset of self-sufficiency, because they were just relying on the machines to take care of it. Right? Same principle. Rely on the machines, then you weaken yourself if you're relying on anybody else. So if you're relying on the hero, you're relying on the political leader to think through everything and take the actions necessary and so on, then you're no longer engaged with that as an individual. So you see how the Voltairean jihad relates to that as well, given what the crusade was up against or going against. Okay, so we covered this. Again, right here, right, we're getting introduced. We'll encounter it throughout the Voltairean jihad and the Orange Catholic Bible, right, which is a fusion of the religious beliefs and the theologies of the time into one single unit. And we're going to talk about that as well, because it's very, and I know I touched on it, it very much is a reflection of how many religions come together. Certainly Christianity, there were many competing Christianities during the first, that period when Jesus Christ was crucified and the people that followed him, and they were disagreeing as to how his presence and death and resurrection should be interpreted. And ultimately, it was very much a conflict and a battle within these competing Christianities until it was finally at the ecumenical councils, starting in around 325 of the Common Era, which said, okay, we have to lay down a very specific doctrine. And this is what constitutes Christianity. And we have to purge the approaches that disagree with ours from Christianity itself. So all the different Gnostic beliefs, there were so many of them, had to be purged. These are the doctrines by which we will abide by. If you disagree with them, if you even challenge them, you will be excommunicated. You will no longer be allowed to be a part of this religion. Extraordinary times and fascinating, to say the least. And we'll touch on that as well, probably frustratingly so, but since we could spend an entire semester, if not an entire year, studying it. At least I've been studying that era in theology for many years. It really is fascinating, but we're certainly getting a sample, because now it's all been brought into this one Orange Catholic Bible, as it's called here. And we'll have to see how that is referenced throughout the novel. And then, as always, see how that is a reflection of attitudes towards religion and theology in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s as well, but mainly because we're focused mainly on the 60s. and that separation of church and state that we've been talking about. So when we get to the second chapter, again, we start with the very beginning here, again, from the Manual of Muad'Dib. To attempt an understanding of the Muad'Dib without understanding his mortal enemies, conflict. The Harkonnens, in conflict with the Atreides. In an attempt to understand the Muad'Dib without understanding the Harkonnens, the enemies, is an attempt to see truth without knowing falsehood. It is an attempt to see the light without knowing darkness. It cannot be. Now, it's a very bold and powerful statement, very much revolving around something that I would argue is consistent in all worldviews, or certainly the vast majority, right? Is there can be no understanding without conflict, right? In its most simplistic terms, right? How can you know what light is if you don't know what darkness is? So much of our understanding of the world is predicated on conflict, on differences, oppositions, right? So I think we touched a bit. We're introduced to Vladimir Harkonnen. We talked a little bit about his name. It's just kind of like a little bit of a shout out to Vladimir is a Russian name, Soviet Union. Is there much there? Well, it's things we take note of, and there's a lot of that here. And it can be difficult to sift through it all. So, just take at this stage what you can, and then we bring it up in class and we try to sift through it as is the same as I am doing. So what transpires here, what we're seeing here is this diplomatic, a kind of diplomacy. And the reason I want to talk about this a bit now is as a means of preparing for our discussion of the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Where what we see, and I'm not going to go through it in too much detail. I got to remind myself we're not in an English class here. For those of you who have me in English classes where I go through line by line. But the main gist here to keep in mind is the procedural motions that governments go through even at a time of great conflict and great differences. And we're going to see this in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The exchange of letters between Khrushchev and Kennedy and their administrations, where there's this kind of gamemanship. This is the proper way to proceed. You are saying this, the way that you will develop an argument, the words you will choose, so as not to offend and yet to get the message across. Of course, anticipating as well that you are going to be, those words will be heard by others, right? So there's this whole diplomatic component to any kind of government. Many things that are said and many things that transpire between these conflicting countries, we don't get to see. So Dune kind of takes some liberties in showing us, and because it's a novel, of what the true intentions are. And this is one of the more difficult things in the real world, is if someone says, no, I have no ambitions towards expanding into another country or in invading another country. How silly. I would never consider such a thing. You're misunderstanding what you're seeing, right? That famously, in 1938, when the Prime Minister of England went to see Adolf Hitler, because there was a lot of concern that Hitler was becoming extraordinarily strong. The German army was building up, and there was a genuine concern that he was looking to expand the German Empire, or create a German Empire by expanding into its neighboring countries. Complicated story going back to the Versailles Treaty after World War I, where much was, we won't get into it now, it's complicated. But famously, Chamberlain went to see Hitler, and Hitler reassured him, 1938. I have no intention of going anywhere outside of the borders as the borders are today. I have no intention of starting war or anything like that. And famously, Chamberlain came back from the meeting with Hitler, saying, peace is at hand, no worries, everyone relax. I've talked with him, and it's all good. But of course, Hitler was lying, right? And the need to be able to see that in the political realm of deception and gamemanship and play. And we're seeing something like that here. And we're going to look at it more closely in the exchange between Khrushchev and Kennedy regarding the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay. So what does dear Alito say? Because they, right, whenever did in our treaties refuse the opportunity for a gesture. Right. This is they're talking about an exchange of diplomatic discussions, right? To make sure there's a peaceful transference, because remember our treaties are coming to Arrakis, and the Harkonnens are there now. The Harkonnens are going to leave, and our treaties are coming in there, Paul and Leto, to take over this all-important planet. All important because it's the only planet that has the spice. Right, and so the Mentat to Peter, right, his advisor, we'll talk more about his role. You made the peace gesture, the forms have been obeyed, right? So this type of diplomatic exchange, you've done what you're supposed to do here. So no one can bring it back to you. You can say, I tried, right? I did everything I was supposed to do, right? Make sure that you cross the T's and dot the I's in case there's investigations. But of course, it's all shaded in what is the real goal. And the real goal underlying all the gesture is to work towards getting closer to your individual, in this case, the Harkonnens' individual worldview of what they want, and so often predicated on the desire for greater power. Again, I don't want to get, you see these terms like mentat and so on, which is what Peter is. Again, these are mentats we're basically trained group to replace computer minds and calculating, and every major house, every major government would have one of them as their advisors. But you can see here when we're engaged with them, this is now very much germane to the story itself, right? See a plan of the most exquisite treachery. Now, again, you should have read ahead by now, so this makes more sense now when you see what actually happens. Interesting lines that you want to remember. I cause pain out of necessity. This is the Baron saying this. But he, talking about Peter, like the Mentat, I swear he takes positive delight in it. And it's drawing a distinction between that political leaders, right, heroes even, will cause pain. You can't please everybody. Will take actions that will cause pain, but it's out of necessity in order to work towards that vision, that view of what we want to achieve. And again, presumably a worldview that is conforming to what the people that leadership represents want as well. And yes, we have to cause pain out of necessity because we have people in opposition to us, and we can't let them stop us from achieving this. Whether what you are trying to achieve is morally justified or not, that gets tricky, right? That relates to the whole concept of, you see this in most wars, drawing back on the religion and the impact of religion is, we'll win because God is on our side, which of course the people you're fighting against are saying the same thing. Everyone feels that their war is justified. And that's a big part of that in terms of the average soldier who's out there and believes that, is predicated on their indoctrination into the ideology that corresponds to the worldview. Always, again, church and state, always coming back to that God is on our side. Like the famous cry, excuse me, the famous cry of the actual crusaders, during that era of crusades, religious-based crusades, where the call of the crusaders as they would go in and massacre entire communities, the call was kill them all, God will know his own. Right? So we don't have time here pragmatically to determine, there may be some Christians here or whatnot. We'll kill them all. God will take care of the good guys, and the bad guys, well, they're getting what they deserve, with this absolute belief that God is on your side. You can justify it by saying this is what God, or, and again, that fusion between the concept of God, the worship of God, right? And the worship of political leadership, when those two go hand in hand, then it allows for the justification of almost anything. If you fall back into it's God's will, if your political leadership is saying it's God's will, if you listen to political rhetoric, still very much alive today, it's God bless America, God bless you. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We're going to come back to that because, again, that is ingrained, and you can see the worldview contained in that. And in that worldview, there is God, the concept of God, whatever that entails. God, in theological terms, being the ultimate authority, otherworldly authority. And here, what's revealed to us is the plots and the planning of the Harkonnens, right? And what I want to draw your attention here to, in particular, in case you missed it, it's not just the Harkonnens who are going to be deceiving and tricking Leto and Paul and their whole thing, but it's also with the help of the emperor, right? The Sardaukars, which are the elite forces of the overall emperor. Remember the political structure, we touched on this. There is an emperor that oversees pretty much all the other governments, countries, planets, if you will. And that emperor is in a precarious position because he is just meant to be able to ensure that everything is going smoothly, and he's not meant to take sides in any disputes among the rest that are down here, right? And we're going to talk in more detail as we proceed, the more comfortable we get with it, with the actual structure of this political system. What's important here is if it were to be found out that the emperor was taking sides, then the emperor's position would be very much challenged. And very much, it's an unacceptable proposition. So it has to be done through deception, right? The Sardaukar will be disguised as Harkonnen troops when the Harkonnens come back and take over the planet after the transfer of power here. Again, it's hard for me to talk about this. I'm realizing now without you here because I don't know how far you've read ahead to understand this. But hopefully you've read far enough to see how this is all unfolding. We have a mention of the traitor, Dr. Yu. Right? Dr. Yu will move against him soon. You should have already gotten to this point in the novel, right? In order to be able to launch the attack, there is the need for the traitor, very common trope, not just in literature and in political intrigue novels, but in real life. There's spies and so on that have a big play in the decisions that political institutions make in terms of how they can achieve their goals. Right? We'll talk a bit as well. I'm realizing I don't think it's avoidable of, and I don't know if I mentioned it last week, of Sun Tzu's The Art of War as a not just doctrine concerning actual warfare, Chinese tract written thousands of years ago, but also very much a treatise on strategy. Standard reading, required reading in most business schools today. Right? And a big part of that is used by the political elite in order to strategize means by which to deal with their adversaries. And now that I think about it, we will have to talk about that. I'll bring that in. Don't worry, I don't mean to overwhelm, but I will touch on that. Again, so we're getting the foundation laid out. And Peter, right? Remember the Mentat has been promised the Lady Jessica, so the intrigue, right? And we've learned as well that Peter is addicted to the spice. Right? So we're already being introduced to the drugs, right? The drug culture of the 60s, as I told you. We're seeing the impact of the spice. You'll see why the spice is the most important commodity, because of its mind-altering effects that allows for the guild to be able to navigate through and bend space in order to travel from planet to planet, all right? But also very much its addictive powers, right? Also, its necessary powers in terms of Paul, and for Paul to realize his place. So keep an eye on that. I don't want to get into that too much yet. And they're asking, what of the Dukeling, the Duke, the child, Paul? He's part of, the intrigue. The trap will bring him to you, Baron, Peter muttered. It's all intrigue. It's all plotting. It's all strategy. Remember, this is after the overtures of diplomacy, which puts it, and this ties it into, things that we'll be talking about back in the 60s. The diplomacy, how sincere is it? Right? And the necessity for political leaders to be able to recognize when diplomacy is just meant to be a cover for deceptive machinations to achieve other goals. And one of the ways you can attest to that and recognize it is by understanding your opponent's worldview, so you can recognize whether what they are saying diplomatically is lending itself to their path towards that worldview. And if you're seeing that it really doesn't mesh with what you know to be their worldview, then you will challenge it and question it. You're going to see this in the Kennedy-Khrushchev face-off. Okay, and this comes back again to Sun Tzu's The Art of War. One of its major tenets is the need and absolute necessity to know your adversary. And you can only know your adversary or the adversarial intents of your adversary if you have information, spies, and things like that. Because if you don't know them, then they have the advantage, and of course, vice versa. So we have people like the Mentats, we have the Ben Gesserit who have abilities to determine truth. So everyone is playing in this intrigue. And you'll see that that's very much what goes on in the political realm, not just in the 60s, but right up to today. And how we, as not being part of that political apparatus, are very much often in the dark. Hence, the need for us to rely on our heroes to trust that they, knowing more than we do, will take the right actions. And there's the danger. Okay, so this is a little bit more about the mentat. He refers to as an it. Remember, it was the mentats were trained basically to replace the computers in terms of their minds and so on. And we'll see more of that. And we see here, there's no punches pulled. I must have him dead, and his line ended. Right, so the Baron is very much now, for our sake, as readers of the novel, very clear that his intentions are the obliteration of the Artrides, with the goal of then controlling Dune, the planet Dune, because that's where all the power is. If you control the spice, you control everything. So the whole plan is deceptive, right up to the Emperor. It seems like it's a promotion for Leto in a sense, right? He's trading one world for another world. But if you remember, we saw it in the first chapter, and it's even referred to in the trailer for the movie, but he'll lose it, right? There's the ability of the Ben Gesserit as well to anticipate the future. Very important idea. Prescience. Okay, so we will have to get into that, but I need to make sure that we're all further along. It's something we'll be discussing when we get into the second part of the novel, right? So we're still a couple of weeks away from that. But the ability to see into the future, anticipate the future, which is also very much related to the spice. They talk about how they managed to get you, Dr. Yu, to be their agent, their spy, the traitor to the Artrides. And again, you depending on how far you've read, you understand how they managed to turn him. And because they had to turn someone who was that close to the royalty of the Artrides family, right? And again, just to remind us, the Sardaukar are disguised in Harkonnen livery. And these Sardaukar are the soldier fanatics of the Padishah Emperor. It's important because it really is breaking the rules that are in place to maintain the stability of what is called the Landsraad, right here. I will, again, I don't want to overwhelm you, but this is very much, and I'll talk about it on Friday a bit more, the structure of this political system. It says, you see how I trust you, Fade. Now, Fade, right, we'll have to come back to him. His relationship to the Baron, right? Baron is grooming Fade to take over for the Baron, seemingly. Fayed, of course, is very close to the age of Paul, so we can see that there will be some mirroring of the two. I'll leave it there for now. No hint of this must ever reach another great house, else the Landsraad might unite against the imperial house and there'd be chaos. Right? So the idea of the chaos that would ensue if it's ever found out that the emperor is taking sides. The other great houses will rebel. Right? The Harkonnens and the Artrides are two of these great houses in this political structure. And we see down here, the main point Peter said is this: the House Harkonnen, right, the Baron here, is being used to do the imperial dirty work. An alliance has been entered into between the Emperor and the Baron. To what end? What is their worldview? And why are they engaging in the attempt to annihilate the Atreides house? But again, these are things that are addressed in the political machinations of well, throughout time, but in our case, particularly in the 60s. What is the Soviet Union's endgame? And what is the Soviet Union thinking about what is Kennedy's endgame? Without clear and open discussion between these conflicting parties, one can't know. And therefore, one has to prepare for any eventuality. And how, in terms of this, the power, we're introduced here to the CHOAM, C-H-O-A-M, right? The CHOAM will have an irrevocable directorship in the CHOAM company. CHOAM was the key to wealth. Okay, the power, those CHOAM directorships, they were the real evidence of political power in the Imperium, right? So the Imperium being the overall, again, these terms, don't get bogged down with them. I will explain them in greater detail. The Imperium passing with the shifts of voting strength within the Landstrad as it balanced itself against the Emperor and his supporters. Well, I'm really going long here, aren't I? All right. There's so much more here I wanted to cover. I think what I'll do is I'm going to wrap it up here. I will come back and briefly revisit this, but I think what I want to do then is put together something so these terms, what the CHOAM company represents in terms of the control of and the power structures and so on versus with the guild, and how the interconnectivity with the Ben Gesserit and all these different organizations that have developed as a result, right, of the Baltarian Jihad and the elimination of the computers, the machines, and so on. And then because I want you to be able to see how these relate to organizations in the 60s in terms of the power. The CHOAM relates to OPEC, the control of oil. Well, I think I talked about that, and I'll throw that out there for you now as well. The relationship, what we're doing is taking place, and so on. The relationship between the melange, the spice, in the Dune world to the dependency, right? You know, they're dependent on the spice. They're dependent on the melange in a similar way that most of the world in the 60s and right up until today, and even before the 60s, are dependent upon oil. And CHOAM as a reflection of and a mirroring of OPEC nations, those who have the most of the oil and control the price of oil. Again, a little preparation for us down the road. If you haven't gotten there, the planetary ecologist, ecology, another major theme here, talking about preservation of the planet, and we'll see how that's reflected in the real beginnings, not absolute beginnings, but a real emphasis in the 60s on ecological matters, the climate, which now is such a huge issue, but it started becoming much more noticeable in the 60s. And that ties into the rebellious attitude and the challenging attitude of the cultural generation that evolved in the 60s. And that led to the drug culture and the rebellious culture, the anti-government culture, but also very much into the ecological culture. the recognition that changes um, to our way of life by just allowing big industry to do what they please, and the pollution that it was causing and the danger that it does to our ecosystem and our planet as a whole. All right, and then I'll wrap up here, and then very tellingly, and to give us an idea of, who were the good guys, who were the bad guys, and we got a pretty good sense, but just for emphasis, we get this, only at this point. You have to see the way that this is described in this chapter. We really never see the Baron. We remember it's described that he's kind of hidden in the shadows during this whole conversation, talking about treachery and deception and taking over and so on. All this political intrigue led by the Baron. And then the Baron is revealed to us as grossly and immensely fat, and with subtle bulges beneath folds in his dark robes to reveal that all this fat was sustained partly by portable suspenders harnessed to his flesh. He might weigh 200 standard kilos actually, but his feet would carry no more than 50 of them. So it's quite the image. And of course, when it's revealed to us, it's after we have been privy to his manipulations and political intrigues. So much is revealed here about what's going to transpire in the next few chapters. All right. Okay. So there it is. When you read through this, when you watch this, you will have questions. Jot them down. We will address as many as we can. Always keeping in mind, especially in regards to the novel, that much of this will be revealed. Much of your confusion will be revealed as you continue reading. All right. In our classes, I'm going to want to spend a good part of the time ultimately coming back to see how it was reflecting what was transpiring in these confrontations and political machinations and intrigue of the Kennedy, Khrushchev, Johnson, Nixon, etc., Cold War era, Vietnam, so on, of the 60s, and the youth, right? Because remember, Paul is 15. Representing a whole youthful generation, and how the youthful generation of the 60s rebelled against some of these worldviews, which they started to recognize weren't really the same shared values that they pretended to be. All right, went a little longer than I anticipated. We will talk on Friday. Please keep reading ahead in Dune. And I probably will, and we'll be going over the documents that were already posted, so I don't anticipate that I'll be posting any more readings for you this week, so that you can continue with Dune and look at, of course, the documents that are already posted. And we'll see you on Friday.